Welcome, dear listeners, to another spine-chilling episode of Shadows and Secrets with me, your host, Mr. Dark. I bring you a tale that will make your heart race, your breath quicken, and your mind question the thin line between reality and the supernatural. This story unfolds in the quiet town of Ravenswood, where an unassuming doctor's life takes a terrifying turn after a mysterious young woman walks into his clinic. What begins as a quest for answers spirals into a confrontation with something ancient, malevolent, and beyond comprehension. Is the shadow merely a figment of a fractured mind? Or is it an unstoppable force lurking just beyond the reach of light? Join me as we uncover the haunting secrets of the shadow of Ravenswood. But beware, not all shadows are cast by the sun. The fog rolled into Ravenswood early that October morning, curling like smoke through the streets. Dr. Alexander Grant, a methodical man with an unwavering belief in reason and science, had just begun his clinic hours. It was a routine day. Patients filed in with colds, sprains, and the occasional bout of flu. In the small waiting area, a girl sat silently in the corner, her presence barely noticed at first. She wore a long coat, buttoned tightly, with a scarf wrapped around her neck and half her face. Her posture was rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When her turn came, the nurse ushered her in, and she moved as though it pained her to take each step. Alexander was reviewing a file as the girl entered his office. The first thing he noticed was the sharp drop in temperature. A sudden chill enveloped the room, unusual for a heated space. He glanced up, and his curiosity was piqued by the patient standing hesitantly near the door. "Come in," Alexander said, gesturing toward the chair across from his desk. The girl walked forward and sat down, keeping her head bowed. "I'm Dr. Grant," he began, offering a kind but professional smile. "What seems to be the problem today?" She hesitated, her fingers trembling slightly as they gripped the edge of her coat. "Megan Harris," she said quietly, as though the effort to speak strained her. "I've been sick. It's been weeks. Fever, weakness. I can barely sleep." Her voice was hoarse, but it wasn't just illness. It was fear. Alexander tilted his head slightly. "And the fever? Have you taken anything for it?" "Yes," she murmured. "It doesn't go away. And—" She trailed off, her hands moving instinctively to the scarf around her neck. Alexander frowned. "May I check your pulse?" Megan hesitated before extending her wrist. As Alexander placed his fingers gently on her skin, his gaze fell on faint, jagged marks trailing up her forearm. "You've been injured," he observed. Megan quickly pulled her hand away, tugging her sleeve down. "It's nothing," she said sharply, the first real emotion she'd shown. "Ms. Harris," Alexander said evenly, "it's my job to help, but I need to know the full picture. Those marks, they aren't nothing. They're old," she said, avoiding his gaze, "and they have nothing to do with why I'm here." Alexander studied her, noting the dark circles under her eyes, the gauntness of her cheeks. "All right," he said finally. "Let's start simple. May I examine your throat?" Megan tensed but nodded. Alexander stood, fetched a small flashlight and approached her carefully. "Tilt your head up a little," he said. She obeyed reluctantly, pulling the scarf down just enough to expose her neck. Alexander froze. A series of thin, crescent-shaped wounds dotted the skin, red and angry as though they had only begun to heal. They were evenly spaced, almost unnatural in their symmetry. "How did this happen?" he asked, his voice steady despite his unease. Megan's eyes darted away. "It's not important." "Ms. Harris, these look serious," Alexander pressed. "Have you reported—" "It's not something the police can fix," she interrupted, her voice trembling. Alexander straightened, sensing the tension building in her. "I only want to help," he said gently. "Whatever is going on, it's affecting your health. If someone—" "No one," she snapped, standing abruptly. No one can help. The chair scraped against the floor as she pushed it back. For a moment, Alexander thought she might cry, but she simply adjusted her scarf and reached for the door. "Megan," Alexander said carefully, "whatever this is, you don't have to face it alone. I can refer you to someone who..." "Don't." She turned, her voice low and urgent. "Just don't." Before he could say another word, she opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The chill that had settled in the room lifted almost immediately, but Alexander couldn't shake the image of those wounds. He sat back in his chair, deep in thought. There was something profoundly wrong with Megan Harris, and as much as he told himself to let it go, he knew he wouldn't. A month passed after Megan Harris's abrupt visit to Dr. Alexander Grant's clinic. With each passing day, the memory of her haunting figure lingered at the back of his mind. The marks on her neck and the terror in her voice were unlike anything he had encountered before. Despite himself, he found his thoughts drifting to her between patients. Then, on a stormy November afternoon, she returned. The clinic was quieter than usual, with rain hammering against the windows and grey clouds blotting out the light. Alexander was finishing a consultation when the receptionist buzzed in through the intercom. "Doctor, there's someone here to see you. No appointment, but she says it's urgent," he sighed. "Send her in." When the door opened, he recognized her instantly. Megan looked worse than before. Her skin was pale to the point of translucence, her frame thinner, and her hands shook as she clutched the scarf around her neck. Her eyes, sunken and shadowed, darted nervously around the room, as though expecting something to emerge from the corners. "Megan," Alexander said, his concern immediate. "What's happened?" She hesitated before sitting, her movements sluggish, as if she had to summon the strength for each motion. "It's worse," she whispered. "Everything is worse." Alexander pulled his chair closer, his gaze fixed on her. "Start from the beginning. Tell me exactly what's going on." Her eyes flicked to the window where raindrops streaked down the glass. It doesn't stop. The dreams, the marks. It's everywhere, every night. I can't sleep. I can't eat. And no matter how far I go, it follows me. Alexander frowned. "Megan, you're not making sense. What follows you?" She stared at him for a moment, her lips trembling. "The shadow," she said finally, her voice barely audible. Alexander leaned back, his skepticism prickling at the edges of his professionalism. "A shadow?" She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "It's not just a shadow. It's something alive, something evil. It comes to me at night, no matter where I go. It drinks my blood." The clinical part of Alexander's brain instinctively searched for logical explanations. Sleep paralysis, psychosis, trauma-induced hallucinations. Yet there was a rawness in her tone, a conviction that unsettled him. "You think this shadow is causing the injuries on your body?" he asked carefully. She laughed bitterly, a sound that sent a chill through the room. "Think? Doctor, I know. Every night it leaves these marks. Every morning I wake up weaker. Has anyone else seen this shadow?" "No one believes me," she said. "I've tried to tell people. They think I'm crazy. But you've seen them, haven't you? The marks. You know they're real." Alexander hesitated. He had seen them, and they were real. Yet, the idea of a supernatural entity haunting her seemed impossible. "Megan," he said cautiously, "I understand you're in pain, and I believe you've experienced something traumatic. But this shadow you're describing..." "You don't believe me," she interrupted, her voice shaking. "You're just like everyone else." "I didn't say that," Alexander said, trying to remain calm. "But sometimes our minds can create explanations for things we don't understand. If you're feeling trapped or afraid, it's possible your body is reacting physically. I can recommend a counselor who..." "No!" Megan slammed her hands on the desk, startling him. "You think this is in my head? That I'm making this up?" "Megan, please," Alexander said, his voice firm but gentle. "I want to help you, but I need you to trust me." Her breathing was erratic now, her entire body trembling. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. For a moment Alexander considered reaching out, but before he could move, she sat upright again. "Trust me when I say this, Doctor," she said, her voice hollow. "Whatever this thing is, it's real. And if you try to get too close—" She paused, looking directly at him. Her expression was devoid of hope, her eyes glassy. "It'll come for you too." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Alexander didn't respond immediately, unsure of what to say. Finally he said, "Let me run some tests. I need to understand what's happening to your body. Blood work, scans. There might be a medical explanation." She shook her head. "No tests will help. This isn't something you can cure. I don't even know why I came back." Alexander opened his mouth to argue, but she stood abruptly, clutching her scarf. "I shouldn't have come," she murmured. "Megan, wait," he said, rising from his chair, but she was already at the door. Before stepping out, she turned to him, her face pale and gaunt in the dim clinic light. "Just stay away," she said. "You can't save me. No one can." The door closed softly behind her, and once again, Alexander was left in silence. He sat back down, running a hand over his face. Megan's words replayed in his mind. "It'll come for you too." Outside, the rain intensified, and a sudden gust rattled the window pane. Despite himself, Alexander glanced at the dark corners of the room, a flicker of unease curling in his chest. For the first time in his career, he doubted his certainty in the limits of medicine and science. The storm came without warning. Rain lashed against the windshield of Dr. Alexander Grant's car, and the wipers struggled to keep up. He had stayed late at the clinic, catching up on paperwork, but now the deserted roads of Ravenswood stretched before him, swallowed by the night. The streetlights barely pierced the curtain of rain, and the sound of thunder rumbled ominously in the distance. As Alexander navigated the winding roads, his mind wandered back to Megan Harris. Her haunted eyes, the desperation in her voice, and the raw fear etched into her every movement lingered like a shadow in his thoughts. Despite her warnings to stay away, something about her story gnawed at him. The rational part of his mind dismissed it as psychological trauma, but a whisper of doubt had taken root, one he couldn't silence no matter how hard he tried. Just as he rounded a bend near the edge of town, his headlights caught something on the side of the road. A figure crouched there, drenched and unmoving. Alexander slowed the car and squinted through the rain. The figure was a young woman, her head bowed, her hair plastered to her face. He felt his pulse quicken as recognition set in. It was Megan. He pulled the car to a stop and rolled down the passenger side window. "Megan!" he called out, his voice barely carrying over the sound of the rain. She didn't respond. Her shoulders were trembling, and she clutched her knees to her chest. Cursing under his breath, Alexander grabbed an umbrella from the back seat and stepped out into the storm. The cold rain soaked through his coat almost instantly. "Megan!" he said more forcefully, kneeling beside her. She flinched at his touch but looked up. Her face was pale, her lips blue from the cold. "Doctor," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "you shouldn't be here." "What are you doing out here in this weather?" Alexander asked, his concern overriding her warning. "You don't understand," she said, her words barely audible. "It's close." "What's close?" he asked, trying to steady her as she swayed on her feet. She grabbed his arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. Her eyes darted around wildly, scanning the darkness behind him. "It's watching us." Alexander followed her gaze but saw nothing beyond the rain and the faint silhouettes of trees. "Megan, you need to come with me. You'll freeze out here." "No!" she hissed, jerking away from him. "I can't. If you stay with me, it'll find you too." Thunder cracked overhead, and the wind howled through the trees. Alexander gritted his teeth, feeling the icy rain seep into his skin. "Megan, whatever you think is out here, it's not safe for you to stay. Get in the car." Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment she looked like she might argue. Then, as if sensing some unseen force, she nodded weakly. Alexander guided her to the passenger seat, closing the door firmly behind her before sliding into the driver's seat. He turned the heat up and handed her a blanket from the back. "Where's your house?" he asked as he adjusted the rear-view mirror. Megan hesitated, pulling the blanket tightly around herself. "It's not far," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander started the car, the engine humming as they rolled back onto the wet road. The silence between them was thick, broken only by the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers. Alexander glanced at Megan, who stared straight ahead, her knuckles white as they gripped the blanket. "What happened tonight?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "It doesn't matter. It always finds me." "What does?" he pressed, his frustration edging into his voice. She turned to him, her expression hollow. "The shadow." Before he could respond, a loud thud echoed through the car, as though something heavy had landed on the roof. Alexander's hands tightened on the steering wheel. What the hell was that? Megan's breathing quickened, and she clutched his arm. "Don't stop," she whispered urgently. "Whatever you do, don't stop." Another thud. This time, it was louder. The car seemed to groan under the weight of something unseen. Alexander's eyes darted to the rearview mirror. The rain and darkness made it nearly impossible to see, but for a fleeting moment he thought he saw movement, a shadow darker than the night itself shifting in the back seat. "Megan," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "Is there someone in the car?" Her wide, terrified eyes met his. "It's here," she whispered. Before Alexander could react, the temperature in the car plummeted. The windows fogged up instantly, and his breath came out in visible puffs. The shadow in the mirror grew, twisting unnaturally, its edges writhing like smoke. It stretched upward, forming an indistinct humanoid shape with glowing white eyes that pierced through the gloom. "Drive!" Megan screamed. Adrenaline surged through Alexander as he slammed his foot on the accelerator. The car skidded briefly on the slick road before lurching forward. The shadow loomed closer, its form solidifying, the white eyes burning brighter. A guttural growl filled the car, reverberating through Alexander's chest. He gripped the wheel tighter, his heart pounding. "What is it?" he shouted, his voice cracking. "It won't stop," Megan cried, curling into herself. "It'll never stop." The growling grew louder, the shadow's shape looming impossibly large in the mirror. Alexander's mind raced, every rational thought drowned out by the primal instinct to survive. Just as the shadow seemed to reach for him, the car burst out of the wooded road into the open stretch leading to Megan's house. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, and the growling ceased. Alexander glanced in the mirror. The shadow was gone. He pulled the car to a shaky stop in front of a dilapidated two-story house. Megan stumbled out, her movements frantic. "You need to leave," she said, her voice shaking. "Now!" "Megan, leave!" she screamed, her fear cutting through the rain like a blade. Alexander hesitated, every fiber of his being urging him to stay, to demand answers. But the look in her eyes, the pure, unrelenting terror, made him nod. As he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching him, hidden just beyond the veil of rain and shadows. For the first time in his life, Alexander Grant felt truly powerless. Alexander couldn't ignore the pull any longer. Megan Harris had wormed her way into his thoughts, her cryptic warnings and haunted eyes keeping him awake at night. The strange events during the car ride only deepened his unease. Rational explanations eluded him, and for a man who prided himself on logic, this was unbearable. He knew he had to confront the source of Megan's terror: the house. The road leading to Megan's home was lined with skeletal trees, their bare branches scratching at the grey sky. The air carried a biting chill that seeped into Alexander's coat as he parked his car and approached the property on foot. Megan's house, or what passed for one, stood at the edge of the woods, a crumbling two-story relic that looked as though it had been abandoned decades ago. The windows were dark and the shingles hung loose on the roof. A wrought iron fence, partially overrun with thorny vines, encircled the property like a protective barrier, or a prison. Alexander paused at the gate, his breath fogging in the cold air. There was a heaviness to the place, a palpable tension that made his skin crawl. He forced himself to push the gate open. The rusted hinges groaned loudly, the sound echoing into the stillness. The pathway to the front door was overgrown with weeds, and the ground beneath his feet was slick with mud. As he reached the porch, the wood creaked ominously under his weight. "Megan?" he called out, his voice hesitant. No answer. He knocked twice, the sound reverberating through the house. Still, there was no response. Alexander glanced around. The sky was overcast, casting a dull light over the property, but even in daylight the house seemed shrouded in shadow. Against his better judgment he tried the door handle. It turned easily, and the door creaked open. The interior was worse than he had imagined. The air was damp and cold, carrying the faint scent of rot. The furniture was sparse, and what remained was draped in white sheets, yellowed with age. Dust motes floated lazily in the dim light filtering through the cracked windows. "Hello?" he called out again, stepping inside. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Alexander's unease deepened as he moved further into the house. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and the floorboards groaned beneath his every step. There were no signs of recent activity, no clutter, no personal belongings, but the chill in the air felt alive, as though the house itself were watching him. He turned into the living room, his eyes drawn to a fireplace blackened with soot. Above it, a family portrait hung crookedly on the wall. Alexander moved closer, wiping the dust from the glass. The image was old, the colors faded, but he recognized Megan immediately. She was younger, perhaps 14 or 15, standing stiffly beside a man and a woman who were presumably her parents. The man had a stern expression, his eyes sharp and calculating, while the woman appeared timid, her gaze downcast. Megan stood between them, her smile strained. The picture unsettled Alexander in a way he couldn't explain. He set it back on the mantel and turned toward the stairs. The second floor was even colder than the first. The hallway stretched out before him, lined with doors on either side. One of them stood slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness. Alexander approached cautiously, his footsteps muffled by the threadbare carpet. As he pushed the door open, he found himself in what appeared to be a bedroom. The room was sparse, with a single bed pushed against the wall and a nightstand beside it. A small lamp sat on the nightstand, its bulb flickering weakly. The bed was unmade, the sheets crumpled and stained. On the far wall, a large mirror hung above a dresser. It was cracked in several places, the fractures distorting the reflection. Alexander approached the mirror, his own warped image staring back at him. For a moment, he thought he saw something move in the corner of the glass, something behind him. He spun around, his heart pounding, but the room was empty. A faint sound reached his ears then, so soft he almost thought he imagined it. It was a low, guttural growl, emanating from somewhere deeper in the house. "Megan?" he called out again, his voice shaky. The growling ceased. Alexander's breath quickened as he backed out of the room. He glanced down the hallway, his eyes drawn to a door at the far end. It was closed, but something about it felt wrong, like a void that shouldn't exist. Driven by equal parts fear and determination, he approached the door. His hand trembled as he grasped the handle and pushed it open. The room beyond was unlike anything he'd seen in the house so far. It was larger than the others, with high ceilings and walls covered in strange symbols scrawled in black ink. A circle was etched into the wooden floor, its edges marked with indecipherable runes. In the center of the circle lay a small pile of ash, surrounded by melted candles. Alexander stared at the scene, his mind racing. It looked like some sort of ritual, something ancient and unsettling. A soft voice broke the silence, startling him. "You shouldn't have come." He turned sharply to see Megan standing in the doorway, her face pale and streaked with tears. "What is this?" Alexander demanded, gesturing to the circle. She shook her head. "It doesn't matter. None of it matters. You need to leave, Doctor." "Not until you tell me what's going on," he said firmly. "Megan, this is serious. Are you in danger? Is someone doing this to you?" Her lips trembled, but she didn't respond. The temperature in the room plummeted suddenly, and the faint growling sound returned, louder this time. "It's here," Megan whispered, backing away. Before Alexander could react, the shadows in the room began to shift. They twisted and stretched, coalescing into a humanoid form in the corner. The figure was tall and impossibly thin, its edges writhing like smoke. Its eyes burned white, and its presence radiated malice. Alexander stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. "It's the shadow," Megan said, her voice shaking. "It's been with me since my father." She trailed off, her eyes wide with fear. The shadow moved closer, its form flickering like a flame. The growling deepened, reverberating through the room. Alexander grabbed Megan's arm. "We need to get out of here. Now!" She didn't resist as he pulled her toward the door, but the shadow was faster. It surged forward, blocking their path, its tendrils snaking out like claws. Alexander's instincts kicked in. He grabbed the lamp from the nightstand and swung it at the shadow. The glass shattered on impact, and the creature recoiled with a guttural shriek. "Run!" he shouted, pushing Megan ahead of him. They sprinted down the hallway and stumbled down the stairs, the shadow's furious growls echoing behind them. As they burst through the front door and into the cold night air, the oppressive weight lifted. The house loomed behind them, silent and dark once more. Megan collapsed onto the ground, sobbing. Alexander crouched beside her, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. "What was that?" he demanded, his voice trembling. Megan looked up at him, her expression one of utter despair. "It's not just the house," she said. "It's me. It'll never stop." The storm had subsided by the time Alexander and Megan reached the safety of his car. Both sat in tense silence, the house looming in the rearview mirror like a dark sentinel. Megan clutched the blanket Alexander had given her earlier, her knuckles white as she twisted its edges nervously. Alexander gripped the steering wheel, his hands still trembling from what he had seen. The shadow, the marks on the walls, the oppressive cold. It defied everything he believed. He stared straight ahead, unable to look at Megan. "What is that thing?" he finally asked, his voice low but firm. Megan didn't respond immediately. She seemed to shrink further into herself, her tear-streaked face pale and gaunt. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. "You've said that already," Alexander snapped, his frustration spilling over. "But I'm here now, Megan. I've seen it. I need to know what we're dealing with." She shook her head, her eyes darting toward the house. "It's not just the house," she said softly. "It's me. It's been with me for as long as I can remember." Alexander turned to face her fully, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean, with you?" Megan's lips trembled, and she hesitated before speaking. "It started with my father," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander leaned closer, his curiosity and fear mingling. "Your father?" She nodded, her gaze distant. "He was obsessed with things, dark things. After my mom died, he started looking for answers. Ways to bring her back, I think. But it wasn't just that. He wanted power, knowledge. He said he found it in an old book he bought from a traveling merchant. At first, it seemed harmless. But then..." She trailed off, her eyes clouding with pain. "Then what?" Alexander urged gently. Megan shivered. "He started performing rituals in the basement. He would chant in languages I didn't understand, draw symbols on the floor. He made me stay upstairs, but I could hear him. The sounds that came from that room." Her voice cracked and she took a shaky breath. "One night he told me to come downstairs. He said he needed me for the ritual to work. I didn't want to, but he forced me." Alexander's stomach churned. "What kind of ritual?" She hesitated again, her fingers tightening around the blanket. "He said he was summoning a guide," she said finally. "Something that would give him the power to bring Mom back. But something went wrong. The air turned cold and the candles went out. I remember screaming, but it wasn't my voice. It sounded like 100 voices all at once. And then it appeared." Alexander's breath caught. "The shadow." Megan nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "It killed him, right in front of me. I don't know how, but I ran upstairs and locked myself in my room. I thought it was over, but it wasn't. It followed me." Her voice broke and she buried her face in her hands. Alexander sat in stunned silence, the weight of her words settling over him like a lead blanket. "It's attached to you," he said finally. She nodded. "It feeds on me, my fear, my blood, and it won't stop until there's nothing left." Alexander's mind raced. It was too fantastical to believe, yet the evidence was undeniable. The wounds on her body, the shadow he had seen in the house, it all pointed to something beyond his comprehension. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" he asked. "I tried," Megan said bitterly. "No one believed me. They said I was crazy. My aunt took me in after my father died, but the shadow followed me there too. She thought I was hurting myself and sent me to therapy. Nothing helped. Eventually, I went back to the house. I thought if I stayed there, maybe it would leave other people alone. But it doesn't matter where I go." Alexander frowned. "Have you tried to get rid of it? A priest? A psychic? Anything?" Megan let out a hollow laugh. "Do you think I haven't tried? I've had every so-called expert in town come through that house. None of them lasted more than an hour. Some ran out screaming. Others just stood there, paralyzed, and left without saying a word. One even fainted." Alexander leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. His medical training told him this was impossible, an elaborate delusion brought on by trauma. But the shadow's presence, the oppressive cold, and the guttural growls weren't something he could dismiss. "Megan," he said, his voice steady, "there has to be a way to stop this. If your father summoned it, there must be a way to send it back." She looked at him, her eyes hollow. "Do you think I haven't searched? Every journal, every scrap of paper my father left behind. It's useless. The only thing I've learned is that the shadow isn't tied to the house. It's tied to me." Alexander's thoughts churned, a mix of dread and determination. He couldn't abandon her now, not after everything he had seen and heard. "Then we need to fight it," he said firmly. Megan stared at him, a flicker of something resembling hope crossing her face. "You don't understand," she said. "It's not just a shadow. It's a part of me now. If you try to fight it, it'll kill you too." "Maybe," Alexander admitted, But I'm not going to let it keep tormenting you. There has to be a way." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "You can't save me, Doctor. No one can." "We'll see about that," he said, his jaw tightening. For the first time in years, Megan felt the faintest glimmer of hope. But as the shadows began to lengthen outside the car, creeping closer to the edges of the headlights, that hope was tempered with the chilling certainty that the worst was yet to come. The drive back to Alexander's home was heavy with silence. Megan sat curled in the passenger seat, her eyes fixed on the dark road ahead, while Alexander gripped the wheel, his mind racing. The revelation of the shadow's connection to Megan had shaken him to his core. He didn't fully understand what he was dealing with, but one thing was certain: she couldn't be left alone. As they pulled into Alexander's driveway, the porch light flickered, casting eerie shadows on the house. His wife, Diana, had left the lights on, a habit of hers when he worked late. The warm glow usually brought Alexander comfort, but tonight it felt insufficient, as though the house itself sensed what was coming. "Come inside," he said as he parked the car. Megan hesitated. "I don't think that's a good idea." "You're not staying out here alone," Alexander said firmly. "If the shadow follows you, then we'll face it together. I won't let it hurt you." Megan's lips quivered, but she nodded, pulling the blanket tighter around her as she followed him inside. Diana met them at the door, her face creased with concern. "Alex, who's this?" "This is Megan," Alexander said, his voice brisk. "She's a patient of mine. She needs a place to stay tonight." Diana raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. She trusted her husband's judgment, though she could see the tension in his face. "Let me get you some tea," Diana said kindly to Megan, who nodded meekly. As Diana disappeared into the kitchen, Alexander guided Megan to the living room. She perched on the edge of the couch, her eyes scanning the corners of the room as though expecting the shadow to emerge at any moment. "You're safe here," Alexander said, though he wasn't entirely sure if it was true. "Safe doesn't exist," Megan muttered. Diana returned with a steaming mug of chamomile tea and handed it to Megan. "Here, sweetheart, this will help calm your nerves." Megan accepted it with trembling hands, murmuring a quiet thank you. "Alex," Diana said softly, pulling him aside. "What's going on? Who is she?" Alexander hesitated, unsure how much to tell her. "She's been through a lot," he said finally. "Her father, he got involved in some things he shouldn't have, and now she's dealing with the fallout. It's complicated." "Complicated how?" Diana pressed. "I'll explain later," Alexander said, his tone firm. "Just trust me for now." Diana frowned but nodded, her unease growing. Night fell quickly. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows, and the trees swayed violently in the storm. Alexander set up a makeshift bed for Megan on the couch, assuring her that she wouldn't be alone. "I'll be right upstairs," he said. "If anything happens, call out. I'll hear you." Megan nodded but didn't speak. She seemed smaller, her shoulders hunched and her gaze distant. Alexander lingered for a moment before heading to bed, where Diana was waiting for him. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice low. "No," Alexander admitted, "but I couldn't leave her out there. She's in real danger." Diana studied him, then reached over and squeezed his hand. "I trust you," she said. They lay in bed, but Alexander couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, set him on edge. His instincts screamed that something was wrong. The attack began just after midnight. Alexander was jolted awake by a blood-curdling scream. He shot out of bed, his heart pounding. "Megan!" he yelled, racing down the stairs. As he reached the living room, he froze. The air was icy, his breath visible in the dim light. Megan was on the couch, thrashing wildly as though something invisible was holding her down. Her screams were raw and guttural, filled with sheer terror. "Get off her!" Alexander shouted, though he couldn't see what he was addressing. The shadows in the room seemed to thicken, swirling around Megan like a living thing. A low, guttural growl filled the air, vibrating through Alexander's chest. "Megan!" Diana's voice called from the stairs as she descended, panic in her eyes. "Stay back!" Alexander yelled. He lunged forward, grabbing Megan's arms and trying to pull her upright. Her eyes flew open, and he saw pure terror reflected in them. "It's here!" she gasped. Before Alexander could respond, a massive force threw him backward. He hit the wall hard, pain exploding across his back. "Alex!" Diana screamed. The shadows coalesced into a humanoid figure, towering over the room. Its form was fluid and shifting, its edges writhing like smoke. The only constant were its eyes, two burning orbs of white light that bore into Alexander's soul. "Get out!" Megan screamed at the shadow, her voice hoarse and desperate. "Leave me alone!" The shadow growled, its form twisting unnaturally. Its tendrils snaked toward Megan, wrapping around her wrists and ankles, pinning her to the couch. "No!" Alexander yelled, scrambling to his feet. Without thinking, he grabbed the iron fireplace poker and swung it at the shadow. The metal passed through the creature, but the contact elicited a furious shriek. The shadow recoiled briefly before turning its burning gaze on Alexander. For a moment, he felt paralyzed, as though the weight of the entity's malice was pressing down on his chest. His vision blurred, and he struggled to breathe. "Leave him alone!" Megan shouted, her voice breaking. The shadow turned back to her, its tendrils tightening. She cried out in pain, her body arching as though an invisible weight pressed down on her. "Diana!" Alexander gasped, his voice strained. "Get the salt from the kitchen." Diana hesitated for a moment, then bolted. The shadow hissed, its form darkening as it loomed over Alexander. He gripped the poker tightly, swinging it wildly to keep the creature at bay. Diana returned moments later, clutching the salt shaker. "Throw it at the circle," Alexander yelled, pointing at the shadow. She hesitated, but then with trembling hands she hurled the salt at the entity. The moment the grains hit the shadow, it recoiled violently, a horrific screech ripping through the air. Its form flickered, the tendrils loosening their grip on Megan. Alexander seized the opportunity, grabbing Megan and pulling her to her feet. "Upstairs!" he shouted to Diana. "Now!" The three of them bolted up the stairs, the shadow's furious growls following them. They barricaded themselves in the master bedroom, the door shaking as the entity pounded against it. Alexander's mind raced. He had bought them a little time, but he knew the shadow wouldn't stop. "We can't stay here," Megan whispered, her voice weak. "It'll kill us all." Alexander looked at her, then at Diana. "There has to be a way to stop this," he said. "There is," Megan said, her eyes hollow. "But it means going back to the house." The drive back to Megan's cursed house was an act of desperation. The storm raged around Alexander's car, rain pelting the windshield like icy needles. Megan sat in the back seat, pale and trembling, while Diana clutched a flashlight in the passenger seat, her face a mask of fear. Alexander's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. Every fiber of his being told him to turn around and run, but Megan's words echoed in his mind. There's only one way to end this. Megan had explained in halting sentences that the shadow's connection to her was tethered to the ritual her father had performed. The only way to sever it was to complete the ritual, a dangerous process that involved symbols, invocations, and confronting the entity directly. "You don't have to do this," Diana had said, her voice trembling as she packed supplies. "This isn't your fight, Alex." But it was too late for that. The shadow had already shown it wasn't content with tormenting Megan alone. It had invaded Alexander's home, threatened his family. He couldn't walk away, not now. The house loomed ahead, its silhouette dark against the flashes of lightning. As Alexander parked the car, the oppressive weight returned, pressing down on his chest like a physical force. "We don't have much time," Megan said as they climbed out, her voice barely audible over the wind. Alexander grabbed a bag of supplies, candles, matches, and the notes Megan had painstakingly compiled from her father's journals. Diana followed, clutching a container of salt. As they stepped onto the porch, the front door creaked open on its own, revealing the dark interior. The air inside was colder than the storm outside, and the faint sound of distant whispers seemed to echo from the walls. "This way," Megan said, leading them to the room where her father's ritual circle had been etched into the floor. The room felt alive with malice. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse faintly, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. The circle in the center of the floor was still intact, though the candles around it had long since melted into hardened puddles. Alexander set the supplies down, his heart pounding. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice tight. Megan knelt beside the circle, her hands trembling as she arranged fresh candles around its perimeter. "We need to light these and draw the entity into the circle," she said. "Once it's contained, we can sever its connection to me using the invocation." Diana frowned. "And if it doesn't work?" Megan didn't answer. The ritual began slowly, with Megan reciting words in a language Alexander didn't recognize. Her voice wavered, but the power of the incantation was undeniable. The air grew colder, and the whispers in the room turned to guttural growls. The first candle flickered to life, followed by the second, then the third. By the time all 6 were lit, the room was bathed in a dim, flickering glow. "Stay inside the salt lines," Megan warned. "It can't cross them." Alexander and Diana stood near the wall, their backs pressed against the cold plaster as Megan continued the chant. The shadows in the room began to shift, gathering in the corners and coalescing into a single mass. The shape grew larger and darker, its edges writhing like living smoke. The temperature plummeted further, and the growling grew deafening. "It's coming," Megan said, her voice trembling. The shadow surged forward, slamming into the edge of the salt circle. It recoiled with a shriek, its form writhing angrily. "Keep chanting," Alexander yelled, gripping the fireplace poker he had brought from the house. Megan's voice rose above the shadow's growls, her words faster and more desperate. The entity lashed out, its tendrils slamming into the walls and floor, sending vibrations through the room. One of the candles flickered dangerously, and Diana rushed forward to shield it from the wind that seemed to come from nowhere. The shadow let out a furious roar, its glowing white eyes fixed on Megan. It lunged again, this time breaching the salt barrier slightly before recoiling. Megan cried out in pain, clutching her chest. "It's still tied to me," she gasped. Alexander moved closer to the circle, the poker raised defensively. "What do we do now?" Megan's eyes were wild with fear. "You have to break the bond," she said. "Inside the circle, you have to sever it physically." "What does that mean?" She pointed to the shadow's form, which writhed and flickered, revealing glimpses of something solid at its center, a core of darkness, pulsating like a heart. Alexander hesitated for only a moment before stepping into the circle. The cold was immediate, biting into his skin like needles. The shadow hissed, its form swirling toward him. "Alex, no!" Diana screamed. He ignored her, his focus on the dark core. With a shout, he swung the poker, striking the mass. The shadow shrieked, its form convulsing violently. Megan continued chanting, her voice hoarse but determined. The symbols on the walls began to glow faintly, their light growing brighter with each passing second. Alexander struck again, this time driving the poker into the core. The shadow screamed, its form exploding outward in a burst of dark energy. The force knocked Alexander backward. and the candles went out all at once, plunging the room into darkness. When Alexander opened his eyes, the room was eerily quiet. The oppressive cold was gone, replaced by a heavy stillness. The candles lay on their sides, extinguished, and the symbols on the walls had faded completely. "Megan?" he called out, his voice weak. "I'm here," she whispered, crawling toward him. Her face was pale but no longer gaunt, and the marks on her neck had faded. "It's gone," she said, her voice filled with disbelief. "You did it." Diana rushed to Alexander's side, helping him sit up. "Are you okay?" He nodded, though his body ached from the impact. "Is it really over?" Megan nodded, tears streaming down her face. "The bond is broken. It's gone." The three of them sat in the dim room, their breaths coming in slow, steady waves. The house felt different now, empty, but no longer hostile. For the first time in years, Megan felt the weight lift from her shoulders. The silence in the room was deceptive. Though Megan, Alexander and Diana sat together, believing the nightmare had ended, the air carried a lingering tension, an unease that gnawed at Alexander. Something didn't feel right. "We should go," Diana said, her voice breaking the stillness. She clung to Alexander's arm, her face pale. "This house, I don't trust it." Megan looked at the extinguished candles, the faint outlines of the ritual circle now smudged on the floor. "It's over," she murmured, almost as if trying to convince herself. "I can feel it. The shadow is gone." Alexander wanted to believe her, but his instinct screamed otherwise. His gaze drifted to the symbols on the walls. Though they no longer glowed, they seemed darker now, etched deeper into the decaying wood. As he stood to gather their things, the room grew colder. A chill swept over them, colder than anything they'd felt before. The shadows in the corners of the room began to move, stretching and twisting unnaturally. Megan froze, her eyes widening. "No," she whispered. The guttural growl they thought had been silenced rumbled through the house, low and menacing. The flickering light of the storm outside cast distorted shapes on the walls, the shadows growing larger, darker. Alexander grabbed Megan's arm. "We're leaving, now!" But the door to the room slammed shut with a deafening bang, the force shaking the walls. Diana screamed, clutching Alexander's arm as the growling grew louder. From the center of the room, the shadows coalesced, forming a shape larger and more terrifying than before. The entity rose, towering over them, its eyes blazing white. This wasn't just the shadow they had fought earlier, it was something more. "It was never bound to you," Megan whispered, trembling. "It's bound to the house." The shadow's form solidified, its edges writhing like black flames. It spoke, its voice a cacophony of guttural whispers that filled the room. "You cannot destroy me," it hissed, its words reverberating through their very bones. Megan's knees buckled and she clutched at Alexander for support. "It's stronger now," she choked out. Alexander felt the weight of the shadow pressing against his chest, suffocating him. "Why? We broke the bond. We finished the ritual." The shadow surged forward, its tendrils lashing out and knocking them all to the floor. "You were foolish to think you could end this," it growled. "The girl was a vessel, but this place is my domain. You will all feed me now." Alexander struggled to his feet, his body aching. He grabbed the fireplace poker, though he knew it was no match for what they faced. "Megan," he gasped, turning to her. "Is there anything else in your father's journals? Something we missed?" Megan shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "There's nothing. He couldn't stop it, and neither can we." Diana clutched the container of salt, her hands shaking. "What if we seal it here? Trap it in the house forever?" Alexander's mind raced. "If it's bound to the house, then maybe we can contain it." The shadow roared, its tendrils lashing out again. Alexander shielded Megan as one of the tendrils slammed into the wall, splintering the wood. Diana scrambled to her feet, spilling the salt in a wide circle around the group. The shadow recoiled briefly, its form flickering, but its rage was palpable. "You cannot escape," it snarled. "You will all die here." Alexander's eyes darted around the room, searching for anything they could use. His gaze landed on the journal Megan had brought from her father's belongings, lying open on the floor. He lunged for it, flipping through the pages frantically. "Megan!" he shouted. "There's something here about fire. What did your father say about fire?" Megan's breath hitched. "He said fire could cleanse the circle, destroy the anchor points, but it would destroy everything else too." The realization hit them all at once. The house wasn't just the entity's domain, it was its prison. If they burned it down, they could trap the shadow forever, but it meant risking their lives in the process. "We don't have a choice," Alexander said, his voice steady despite the chaos. Diana grabbed the matches from the supply bag, her hands trembling. "You're sure about this?" Alexander nodded. "It's the only way." The shadow howled, sensing their intent. It surged toward them, its form expanding, consuming the air in the room. Alexander swung the poker, buying them precious seconds as Diana lit the first match. "Get out of here!" Alexander yelled, throwing the match onto the brittle wooden floor. The flames caught quickly, licking up the walls and consuming the remnants of the ritual circle. The symbols on the walls glowed briefly, then began to burn, releasing an ear-piercing shriek from the shadow. Megan stumbled toward the door, Alexander and Diana close behind. The shadow thrashed wildly, its tendrils tearing through the room as the fire spread. "You cannot escape me!" it roared, its voice a mix of fury and desperation. The heat was overwhelming as they burst into the hallway, smoke filling their lungs. Alexander threw his shoulder against the front door, forcing it open, and the three of them stumbled into the rain-soaked night. Behind them, the house burned brightly, flames consuming the structure as the shadow's roars echoed into the storm. They collapsed onto the wet grass, coughing and gasping for air. Megan watched the house burn, her expression a mix of relief and sorrow. "Is it over?" Diana asked, her voice barely audible. Alexander stared at the inferno, the shadow's form writhing in the flames. Slowly, the roars faded, and the house began to collapse in on itself. "It's over," he said finally, though his voice carried a trace of doubt. They sat in silence, watching as the fire consumed the last remnants of the house. The oppressive weight that had followed them for so long was gone, replaced by a strange, hollow stillness. Megan turned to Alexander, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, his exhaustion finally catching up to him. "Let's just hope it's gone for good." As the flames died down and the first rays of dawn broke through the storm clouds, the three of them realized they had survived. But in the ashes of the house, something moved, a faint wisp of shadow curling upward, disappearing into the morning light. The ruins of the Harris house smoldered in the early morning light, sending thin tendrils of smoke curling into the pale sky. The once imposing structure was now a charred skeleton, its blackened beams jutting out like broken ribs. The oppressive weight that had lingered over the property for decades had lifted, but in its place was a haunting stillness, a silence that felt fragile, as though it could shatter at any moment. Alexander, Diana, and Megan stood at the edge of the property, their faces streaked with soot and exhaustion. None of them spoke for a long time, the crackle of dying embers and the distant chirping of birds filling the void. "It's really gone," Megan said at last, her voice trembling. Alexander glanced at her. She looked different, not just physically, though her face had regained some of its color, and the haunted shadows under her eyes had begun to fade. There was a lightness about her now, a weight that had been lifted. "I think so," he said, though doubt lingered in the back of his mind. He had seen the shadow consumed by the flames, heard its final furious roar as the house collapsed. But the faint wisp of darkness that had escaped into the dawn still nagged at him, a ghost of uncertainty. Diana touched his arm, drawing him from his thoughts. "We should go," she said softly. "There's nothing left for us here." Megan nodded but didn't move. Her gaze remained fixed on the ruins, her expression unreadable. "Megan," Alexander asked gently. She turned to him, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "I don't know what to do now," she admitted. "This house, my father, the shadow, it's all I've known for so long." "You start over," Diana said, her voice kind but firm. "You're free now. You can have a life, your own life." Megan looked away, her shoulders slumping. "I wouldn't even know where to begin." Alexander placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "One step at a time," he said. "You've survived this. That's no small thing. You're stronger than you think." She gave him a small, hesitant smile. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The drive back to town was quiet. Megan sat in the back seat, staring out the window as the countryside rolled past. Diana leaned her head against Alexander's shoulder, her exhaustion finally catching up to her. When they reached Alexander's home, Diana insisted on Megan staying with them for a few days. "You need a safe place to rest," she said, ignoring Megan's protests. No arguments. Reluctantly, Megan agreed. She spent the next few days in the spare bedroom, slowly regaining her strength. Alexander checked on her frequently, more out of habit than necessity, but Megan seemed to improve with each passing day. The marks on her neck faded completely, and though she still startled at sudden noises and avoided dark corners, the constant tension in her body began to ease. One evening, as Alexander sat alone in his study, reviewing the journal they had taken from the Harris house, he felt a flicker of unease. The journal's pages were brittle and charred at the edges, but the symbols and incantations were still legible. He had hoped the answers were in these pages, but the more he read, the less certain he became. The final entry from Megan's father sent a shiver down his spine. "The entity is clever. It will feign weakness, retreat when threatened. But it is eternal, patient. It cannot truly be destroyed, only contained. And even containment is temporary." Alexander closed the journal abruptly, his pulse quickening. He stared at the shadows cast by the lamp on his desk, half expecting them to move. A knock at the door startled him. "Alex?" Diana's voice called softly. He exhaled, forcing himself to relax. "Yeah?" She stepped inside, her expression concerned. "You've been in here a while. Is everything okay?" He hesitated, then nodded, just trying to make sense of all this. Diana sat on the edge of his desk, her eyes searching his. "It's over," she said, as though trying to convince herself as much as him. Alexander reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "Yeah," he said, though the doubt in his voice was unmistakable. A week later, Megan packed her things and prepared to leave Ravenswood. Alexander and Diana stood with her on the porch, watching as she loaded her single duffel bag into the back of an old pickup truck she had borrowed from a neighbor. "Are you sure about this?" Alexander asked. Megan nodded. "I need to go," she said. "Staying here, it's too much. Too many memories." "Where will you go?" Diana asked. Megan shrugged, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Anywhere but here." Alexander handed her an envelope. "There's some cash in here," he said, "just in case." Megan hesitated, then took it, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." Diana hugged her tightly. "Take care of yourself," she said, "and remember, you're not alone anymore." Megan climbed into the truck and started the engine. As she drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror, watching Alexander and Diana grow smaller and smaller until they disappeared entirely. For the first time in years, she felt hope, fragile but real. That night, as Alexander and Diana sat by the fireplace, enjoying the quiet, a familiar chill swept through the room. Alexander stiffened, his eyes darting to the darkened corners of the house. "Alex?" Diana asked, noticing his unease. He forced a smile. "It's nothing," he said, though his hand instinctively tightened around the poker resting beside the fireplace. In the shadows near the doorway, a faint wisp of darkness flickered before disappearing into the night. And somewhere far away, as Megan drove down an empty road, her radio crackling faintly with static, she felt a familiar chill crawl down her spine. The shadow was gone, but not entirely. It never would be.